This is part 6 of the Lackawanna Cut-Off, where today we're going to talk about why the cutoff was built. We're also going to take a tour of the Lackawanna Old Road to show you basically why the cutoff was built. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, and I'm president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association. And we're here at Port Morris again to start a trip over the old road. Now, here's the cutoff. 28.5 miles from this spot is Slateford Junction, going in this direction. Via the old road, it's 39.5 miles in this direction, going to Slateford Junction. So, first of all, there's a difference of 11 miles. So if we're going to talk about why the cutoff was built, one thing in favor of building a new route would be that, in this case, it would be 11 miles shorter. But if you look at the difference between running a train between here and Slateford Junction, that's really a dramatic difference. For example, if you were to take a train from this location, an imaginary train today, and go via the cutoff to Slateford Junction, a passenger train would take a little bit over a half an hour, maybe less than a half an hour, depending if it stopped anywhere along the way. The same train going in this direction via the old road would have taken about 50 minutes, so about 20 minutes longer. With a freight train, it becomes even more dramatic. A freight probably could make it over the cutoff in 35 minutes or so, maybe 40, depending on the type of freight. Via the old road, however, we talk about it upwards of an hour and a half. So you think, okay, 11 miles difference at an average of maybe 60 miles an hour, it should only be 10 minutes for a passenger train and maybe 20 minutes or so for a freight train. Why the big difference? Well, the big difference could be accounted for by the curves on this line, 2 tunnels, which we're going to take a look at, bridges, and so forth. In other words, speed restrictions that made this route much, much slower. So that is just one reason. In addition, there were grades on this line which didn't exist on the cutoff. So collectively, looking at all the problems which cause operational issues on the old road, essentially what happened was that the Lackawanna Railroad management decided they needed to replace this road with this one. Now, the story isn't quite that simple, but because there's a lot of history in it. Really, it was over half a century in the making where the old road would eventually be replaced by the cutoff. Now, we're going to be showing a map as we go along to help you keep track of where we are and where we've been. I'll point out one final thing before we move on to our next spot, which will be Netcong, that this route, the old road, was never really intended to be a route at all, as a matter of fact. There were 3 different railroads that were, in a sense, put together in order to create this route. Right here, this route here was the Phillipsburg branch, what became the Phillipsburg branch. So it ran from Hoboken to Phillipsburg, New Jersey. At Washington, New Jersey, it crossed the Warren Railroad, which would become part of the old road. And then at the Delaware River, the Warren Railroad connected into the Bangor and Portland division of the Lackawanna. So basically 3 railroads became one, and they were never really intended to be operated as one unit. So that's an additional reason why the cutoff was built, but there's much more to it, and we're going to get to that as we go along. So certainly join me as we now move from here at Port Morris on several stops toward making our way eventually to Slateford Junction, where we'll look back at where we've been, and hopefully by that time you'll understand more thoroughly why the Lackawanna Cut-Off was built. Here we are at Netcong Station, which is the next stop. We're about 2.5 miles west of Port Morris Junction. We're heading westbound, or if you look at a compass, southbound. At least for the time being, we're heading southbound on the old road. Now, Netcong was the first stop west of Port Morris. For a number of years, it was the last stop for the Erie Lackawanna, and then after that, New Jersey Transit. The service has been, I'm talking about commuter service now, has been extended since the mid-1990s to Hackettstown, which we'll visit in a little bit. There was quite a bit here at one time at Netcong. What we're looking at here, what is now New Jersey Transit, was originally the eastbound main of the old road in this location. On the other side of the station, first, immediately adjacent to the station, was the westbound main of the old road, and then the next track after that was the Sussex branch, which went to Andover, as we visited in when we went to the Pequest River. The Sussex branch went under the Cut-Off in Andover, and then went to Newton, New Jersey, and then as far as Branchville, New Jersey. Why were there a westbound and eastbound main? Well, of course, there normally would be an eastbound and westbound main if you had two tracks going east and westbound. But the difference here in this section between here and almost as far as Hackettstown is that there was a fairly steep grade of about 1%. 1%, I'll explain in a second what that means. The two tracks, the east and westbound mains, are actually separated as they are here, but they are at different places, separated not only in distance but in grade. In other words, one would be higher than the other to compensate for the difference for the grade going up the hill from not only just Waterloo but west of Waterloo to here. We'll visit Waterloo as well. Now, what is a grade? Well, 1% grade means that for every 100 feet traveled, there's an increase or decrease in the level of the track by 1 foot. Well, that probably doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you project it out, let's say, to 10,000 feet, which is roughly about 2 miles, then you're talking about a difference of 100 feet, which is about the amount of a 10-story building. So, and there would be greater grades even on the Lackawanna. Let's say if you look in Pennsylvania, where you're talking about 1.5%, which would be 1.5 feet per 100 feet and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that hill here, which is just starting at this location and going on for about 5-6 miles, added time to trains going uphill in this direction, in other words, eastbound, particularly freight trains. So as we were talking about the difference in time, it's not only just difference that makes a difference in terms of time, but also the other obstacles or issues with the actual topography of the line. So, what else can I say about Netcong? This particular station was designated as a location for the State Railroad Museum in New Jersey, together with Phillipsburg, which is the far end of, not on the old road, but the far end of what this line was called at one time, the Phillipsburg branch. So, that's it for Netcong. Our next stop will be Waterloo, and we'll look at, well, there isn't very much there, but there are some things we want to talk about that were located at Waterloo. Here we are at Waterloo Station, which is not a station anymore. It hasn't been a station for nearly 60 years. Behind me is the old turntable pit, which was used to turn locomotives that came in here when the Sussex branch used to come into this location. After 1901, the Sussex branch was actually moved over to Netcong, as we saw. The reason for that is that the the connection here was westbound, and well, that was one of the reasons for the turntable being here. What else was here? Well, if we turn around and look around, you can see the difference in the elevation of the two tracks. Well, the one in the back, which is New Jersey Transit, and the right-of-way here for the old westbound, which is quite a bit lower than the eastbound track. Route 80 is over here, and in fact, when you go past, you take a look, you can actually see the embankment for the old Sussex branch on the other side of the highway. One other thing that is notable here is that, and we'll turn around once again, that there were two routes of the cutoff that were surveyed that would have left from right about here. Lines D and G, as a matter of fact, would have left from here. One of the reasons why those particular routes were rejected was because of the grade that still exists or would have existed on those lines from here to Netcong. So those two particular routes, and there's actually a couple more that would have left west of here off of the old road, those were rejected as well, as a matter of fact. So our next stop here on the old road will be at Hackettstown. Okay, here we are at Hackettstown, just a little bit shy of milepost 57. That's 57 miles from Hoboken. Netcong, which is in that direction, eastbound from here, was at milepost 48. So by doing the math, we're roughly about 9 miles west of Netcong. In between, there's actually a New Jersey Transit station at Mount Olive. This is the end, or the end of the line for New Jersey Transit rail service. Norfolk Southern also provides freight service on this section of the line. We are, from this location, about 4 miles from a location of a major accident that occurred 90 some years ago now. That's going to be our next stop. Hackettstown, as you can see, is lots of mountains around here. There was one projected line that would have started, that would have been for the cutoff, that would have started several miles east of here and would have had to have bored through this mountain here for a tunnel. That particular route was rejected, as well, as I mentioned, of the ones that were also rejected that would have gone out of Waterloo. And we'll also talk about, when we get to our next stop, about why the station master here stopped the freight train. And that'll be part of the total story that we'll talk about 4 miles west of here. Here we are at Hazen Road in Rockport, New Jersey, which is part of Mansfield Township, New Jersey, where on June 16th, 1925, a Lackawanna train came through this location from this direction and derailed at this grade crossing. Now, the circumstances of the derailment are fairly well known. The train started in Buffalo. It was carrying 180 German Americans who were going to be going to a trip to Europe on a boat out of New York Harbor. They left the day before from Buffalo on the Lackawanna. At about midnight on the morning of June 16th, 1925, they reached Scranton, Pennsylvania, and they were told at that time, the engineer was told at that time, that the train would be, instead of being routed over the cutoff as it originally had been planned to be routed, it would be rerouted via the old road. That would have significant implications for the outcome of the trip for this particular charter train, if you want to call it that. While the train was en route between Scranton and this location, a severe thunderstorm hit in this area. Lightning would strike a lumber yard not very far from the Hackettstown station where we were just now, and start a major fire there. At this location, there was a torrential downpour, and this road had seen some maintenance that very day, where loose gravel and such had been basically fixed onto the road. However, the downpour washed that material onto this grade crossing here. Now, it was different in those days, but there were flanges and such, and somehow whatever the debris that came down from that hill here washed onto this area between the rail and the road. What happened is that the train coming from that direction around 2:30 or so in the morning, at varying accounts going anywhere between 45 and 70 miles an hour. We don't know exactly, they're different accounts. Let's say for the sake of argument that it was doing at least 50 or 60 miles an hour. The locomotive, steam locomotive, hits the grade crossing, and the front trucks of the locomotive derail. And what happens is that the trucks actually move from being aligned like this to like this. I'm going to move in this direction now. Those front trucks continue like this, and at roughly the location of that first power pole there, which is about 198 feet from the grade crossing, there is a switch. And the switch is what they call a trailing switch. So it'd go from the track that's no longer there over to here. And what that did was it forced the front trucks of this locomotive, which are literally bumping up the ties along as it goes at 50 some odd miles an hour, hits the switch, and now gets not only derailed but gets thrown off to the side, and the locomotive ends up roughly about where that second power pole is, on its side. Now all this is happening quickly. You can imagine the momentum of a train going 50, 60 miles an hour and decelerating that quickly. The engineer is killed. One of the cars actually ends up on top of the steam locomotive, which is now on its left side, rips off steam fittings that now throw steam up into the car itself. Most of the people that would die, and the accounts say that there were 50 people who actually died total in this particular accident. Most of those people did not die from the actual accident itself. They were scalded to death, and many didn't die here. They died en route to hospitals in that direction to Morristown and to Dover, and in that direction to Easton, for example. The porter who actually ended up being identified as a hero, O.J. Daniels, and don't forget, this is in the middle of the night, and in this location in those days there was nothing here except the farm, the Rockport game farm. A few isolated houses were here, But basically, we're 4 miles away from Hackettstown, so we're really in the middle of, the middle of nowhere. So, Mr. Daniels, who manages to save several passengers, or either pulls them out or is in the mayhem that actually followed the accident, was able to either pull people out or close the door to keep steam from going anywhere else where it would harm additional passengers. But as legend has it, or the story goes, he leaves the scene and tries to get help, because there's no way to call for help in those days. In fact, as it turned out, he went over to the game farm here, and not only the power was out, but the phone lines are out. So somehow word is brought to town, and help does eventually come. Many of the people who would be at that fire that I was talking about end up coming over here to help at this location. This would turn out to be the accident where more people died at any one location than any other accident in the history of Warren County, and certainly one of the worst in New Jersey history, and the Lackawanna Railroad history. This location didn't take very long for them to clear it out, and in those days things would move rather quickly, whereas in something like that were to happen today, the NTSB would shut this location down, and it would be days or maybe even weeks before the location would be allowed to, where the trains would be able to run again. An inquest or an investigation was started a while, not very long after, within a few days, which was held, I believe, in Washington, and no one is basically found at fault. The town or the road crew, the railroad, the train apparently was going within the posted speed limits, although there are accounts that say that it was possibly exceeding the speed limit, but we don't know for sure. So, and ironically, most of the people who were on that train were able to make it to Hoboken, and they were able to get on their ship and set sail for Germany, for their sightseeing tour of Germany the following morning. Now, the thing about why was the train rerouted via the old road? Apparently there was some sort of freight traffic on the cutoff that morning. This is, shortly after midnight we're talking about now. And because this train, the special excursion train, was not due until 8 o'clock the following morning in Hoboken, there was really no rush in order to get the train there. So rerouting it via the old road, even though it did prolong the trip, at least under normal circumstances, wouldn't have had any effect. Of course, it was tragic and freakish that this particular grade crossing here would have been such that it would cause a derailment. That's something you never can predict, of course. Now, I mentioned about the station master back at Hackettstown. So happens that he heard this train blowing for the Hazen Road grade crossing, 4 miles away, but he could hear that. He was waiting for the train to blow for the next grade crossing, which is at Airport Road, about a mile or so away from here. He never heard that. Because he didn't hear it, he figured that something was wrong, and when a freight train was coming westbound through Hackettstown, he stopped that freight and held it at Hackettstown until he could find out what was wrong. As it turns out, that was a great thing, because who knows what would have happened if that freight came upon this wreck that was sitting over not too far from this grade crossing. In fact, cars would have been here, and it just can't imagine what would have possibly happened. So that's what was called the Rockport wreck, June 16th, 1925. Our next stop will be at Washington, where we'll talk about not only the old road, but we'll talk about the Warren Railroad. Here we are in Washington, New Jersey. Now I'll try to orient you to what was here, just to explain how this all ties in with the old road. If you look in this more or less diagonal area in here, between the Phillipsburg branch, where I am standing, and the old road, which is the track that goes on the opposite side of where the station was. If we look over here, this is the right-of-way of the Warren Railroad, and we're going to visit two spots in this direction, Hampton and Changewater, where there's a big trestle. But this is not part of the old road. It is part of the Warren Railroad, and what's important about the Warren Railroad is that if you came here in 1856, the Warren Railroad was the only thing that was here. This railroad, the Phillipsburg branch, was not here. So, and that's the direction, just to orient you, that's the direction looking towards Netcong. It would be another 10 years before this line came through here after 1856. And at that time, there actually was no connection made between these two lines. Now, why is that? Well, the old road, as I point out, which is back there was no intention of building an old road. Of course, it wouldn't have been called the old road for another 60 years or so when the Cut-Off was built. But originally what happened was that the Central Railroad of New Jersey at Hampton, what would be Hampton Junction, had more or less contracted with our friend John I. Blair to build a railroad between Hampton and Columbia or Delaware near Portland. And that railroad was built. It finally opened in 1862 completely. It actually opened in 1856, but it took another 6 years for Oxford Tunnel to be completed. We'll visit there as well. So by the late 1860s, however, the Lackawanna, which was now using the Warren Railroad through here to get to basically the New York Harbor. Well, it went as far as Elizabethport, which really was close, but not on the water, so to speak. There was actually a plan, at least from the Lackawanna's perspective, to merge with the Central Railroad of New Jersey, the CNJ as we'll call it, and basically have one railroad. The problem is the CNJ really wasn't interested in merging with the Lackawanna. It already had enough traffic on its own line, and from the Lackawanna's perspective, they didn't want to continue in a relationship where a good 50 some odd miles of their eastern part of the railroad wasn't under their control. So what happened? Well, after the Morris and Essex came through with their Phillipsburg branch, the Lackawanna decided, well, the best thing would be to acquire the Morris and Essex. So what happened was the Lackawanna continued to use the Warren Railroad up until this point, Washington, New Jersey, and then switched on to the Phillipsburg branch, or the Morris and Essex, and that way they were able to get to Hoboken. They actually bought the railroads. They bought the Morris and Essex. So now they've cobbled together a route which they originally wanted to go that way. Now they have to go that way, and they're now way out of their way. You know, they've gone way south of where they want it to be. So they're kind of stuck with this route. And we'll be stuck with this route for quite some time, as a matter of fact, until after the turn of the century, in 1905 or such, when the Lackawanna starts really seriously looking at an alternate route, which would end up being the Lackawanna Cut-Off or the New Jersey Cut-Off. So, in any case, here we have this old road, which now becomes the only route that the Lackawanna has in order to access to Hoboken, between Scranton, Hoboken, and such. So we'll look at the two stops over on this side, on what would become the Hampton branch, and then we're going to go west on the old road and look at the problems that existed there, and there were several. And collectively, all those, including the fact that this route is now way south of where the Lackawanna would have liked it, collectively now you have building a case for building a new route, which would be much further north from here. So our next stop is going to be Hampton Junction, and then we'll head on to Changewater and then come back, and then we'll head on west on the old road. Here we are at Hampton Junction on the Central Railroad of New Jersey, right here. The Lackawanna's Hampton branch, or the Warren Railroad as originally it was built, came into here and would have switched in just before where this bridge is on, that's Route 31, today's Route 31. There's another bridge, which we'll show you a photo of, that has since been dismantled over Route 31, that anyone who's traveled through this area would probably recognize, which is also part of the original Warren Railroad. This is not the old road, remember. This part was separate and only served to connect the rest of the Warren Railroad to the Central Railroad of New Jersey. When the Warren Railroad was originally built, it was built to a 6 foot wide gauge. This is standard gauge, as is every other railroad just about in the United States today. 4 foot 8.5 inches between the rails. The Lackawannas originally and the Warren Railroad were originally built to 6 foot, which would be another foot and 4 inches out this direction. The Central Railroad of New Jersey actually laid an additional track, so there actually were 3 tracks along their right-of-way between here and Elizabethport for the time that the Lackawanna was using the Central Railroad of New Jersey east of here to bring freight back and forth. So our next stop from here, we're going to now start moving west, and we're going to stop at Changewater, where there was basically the most significant structure on the Warren Railroad was built there. Here we are at Changewater, New Jersey, on the Hampton branch of the Warren Railroad. Above us here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 old abutments. The bridge was dismantled in 1959, and this travels over the Netcong River here, Changewater, rather bucolic, sleepy sort of town, site of a rather infamous murder in 1843 or so, just on the other side here. The bridge was never upgraded from the bridge that was originally installed here, built here by John I. Blair's contractors going back to 1856. The reason for that is that by the time that there would have been an upgrading, shall we say, of the bridge, which happened when President Truesdale took over in 1899, where there was lots of bigger locomotives, bigger cars, and so forth, it was already clear that, and in fact they've already been using the old road which bypassed this here for, at that point, over 40 years. So as a result, the original bridge stayed until the very end and then was dismantled. Supposedly there's someone who actually died during the dismantling, falling off of one of these piers or at maybe the bridge itself. I don't have those details, but extremely unfortunate, of course. I should add that the Warren Railroad, by the way, at the time, and once when we're going back to 1856 when it opened, was on a per mile basis the most expensive railroad line that had ever been built up until that time. It goes through some territory that's difficult to navigate in terms of construction-wise, so in some ways that's not fairly understandable. But in any case, this is really the most substantial structure on the line. We'll show you some more, but this is really the one, but it's gone, unfortunately. There are photos of it when it was in operation, but it was clear by the time that the Lackawanna was getting ready to merge with the Erie that this line would no longer be of any use, and it was abandoned. So our next stop will be back to Washington, and then we'll be moving on west from there on the Warren Railroad, and also what is also part of the old road. Okay, here we are back at Washington. Now what we're going to do is go west from this point, and we're going to visit some places along the way to give you an idea geographically the relationship not only of the Warren Railroad but also the old road on our way back towards Slateford Junction. Here we are at the eastern portal of Oxford Tunnel. As you can see, the tunnel has a water problem and a little bit of ice, and even though this hasn't been a very cold winter, there's actually ice formation here. Now when this tunnel opened, and it took 6 years beyond the opening of the rest of the Warren Railroad for this tunnel to open. It opened in 1862, whereas the rest of the Warren Railroad opened in 1856. When it opened, there was only one track that went through this tunnel. It's not a very wide tunnel. And for a short period of time, there actually were two tracks. They actually had to expand in certain places along the right-of-way as well, but they didn't here to accommodate a second track. So that arrangement continued up until about 1901. And we're talking about President Truesdale. He has a mandate to not only make the trains faster on the railroad from end to end, but also to put bigger capacity freight cars, bigger locomotives, and so forth. And what that meant was that this tunnel was actually too small to accommodate two tracks now. So what was done is that the tracks were gauntleted. Now, to explain what a gauntlet track is, imagine that there are two sets of tracks normally, and they're side by side, and they would go through this particular tunnel. Well, with a gauntlet track, the tracks overlap each other, so that basically it's, while the trains don't necessarily have to slow down to go through, there actually is you can only run one train in one direction at a time, as it turns out. Now this tunnel, and we're talking about the problems of on the old road and why the cutoff was built, this was the biggest problem overall on the entire route because of the gauntleting of the tracks. The trains had to stop, they had to slow down, they had, to go through the tunnel, and so forth. We have one more tunnel to go through in a little bit, and adding them together, in addition to the fact that the route was 11 miles longer, had a heavy grade going out to Netcong, you get the idea that there were multiple issues with this particular route. In terms of ice formation here, aside from the water, which gets cold enough turns to ice, they actually installed doors on this particular tunnel to try to keep the tunnel warmer, quote unquote, than it would if it were left wide open. What that did was trap smoke in there, which made it very nasty for the engineers and anyone on the crew on the train going through the tunnel. The tunnel was roughly a little bit under 4,000 feet long, so you figure it's a little bit under a mile. And the reason why it took an extra 6 years was because this is very hard gneiss, that would be G-N-E-I-S-S, rock that is extremely hard. And so for the 6 years that the Warren Railroad was in operation before this tunnel was opened, there was a railroad track that actually ran over the tunnel, and there are certain places where you can actually see where that right-of-way was. In some places it went through cornfields, so you can't see it there, but there are other places where it still exists. In any case, this was the biggest problem on the entire railroad, not even just the Warren Railroad itself. We didn't go to the east, or I should say the western portal, because as bad as it is here in terms of wetness now, it's even worse on that side. So our next stop is going to be at a location of a bridge that you probably wouldn't know was even there, and that will be roughly about 3-4 miles from this location. Here we are at the Pequest River, where the old road crosses the river, not only the river, but the right-of-way of the old Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad, or Railway, and then the river itself. This is the only place in the Lackawanna where the railroad crossed another railroad and a river at the same location. Now, it's not very substantial looking or very spectacular from this vantage point. We see photos from down below, and we didn't want to trek down into the mud today, as it turns out, but the photos actually show a bridge that would have been much longer. It's been truncated, but here we are basically at the junction of routes 46 and 31. This would be considered White Township near Buttsville, New Jersey. And this is part of the old road, and you wouldn't necessarily know this is here. It's very close to the roadway, but it's not easily seen from the roadway. So our next stop is going to be at the one remaining station on the Warren Railroad. It unfortunately had a fire in 2016, but we'll take a look and survey what the situation is there. Here we are at the Bridgeville station at Bridgeville, New Jersey. We're standing on the old road, the Warren Railroad here. This is the old station. Unfortunately, most of it burned in 2016. I believe that the back end was really the station, and this has like been added on, and this was a warehouse of some sort. It's been various businesses over the years, but this is the only edifice that remains on the Warren Railroad of any of the original buildings, of station buildings. So, our next stop, and this is, by the way, located on Route 519, our next stop is going to be at the second tunnel on the old road, the one at Manunka Chunk. Here we are at the western portal to Manunka Chunk tunnels. Two tunnels. Originally there was only one tunnel. And then, as I mentioned when we were back at Oxford Tunnel, at some point the railroad had to double track the Warren Railroad, the old road, and as a result they needed another tract to come through here. Well, instead of widening the original tunnel, they realized that the rock through which the tunnel would go was unstable and would not support them trying to rip apart more of it to create a wider portal. As a result, they borrowed a second tunnel side by side with the original tunnel. Now, as you can see here, water is a major issue. It usually is in tunnels, but in this location and on the eastern side, or the eastern portal for this, it's debatably even worse than it is here. Now, when they built the tunnel, they had to realign or basically shift the location of a brook. I believe it was called Catherine's Brook or something like that. And they created a flume which would channel that water away. The problem is that there have been, over the years, several extremely large deluges, if you will, and that flume could no longer handle that water. And in some cases, there used to be a tower over here. There are photos from, I want to say 1913, 1914, after the cutoff had opened, where the tunnel, where the tower is basically leaning down the embankment here. We're well above the area below. Route 46 is just below us, and the river's fairly long distance from us here, maybe a quarter mile, the Delaware River. What else was here? Well, there was a station here with a nice overhang. There was a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit through this tunnel, and Oxford as well. So as a result, you can imagine trains have to slow down to come through here and even to stop. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran on their Belldale line to this location, and in fact, they had trackage rights all the way to Gravel Place in Pennsylvania. That was just a little bit west of East Stroudsburg. And until the 1950s, they'd actually run trains which would come through here. In the later years, they were just single, like, gas-powered type of single car, a unit type of passenger car. As you can imagine, this would also be a problem with water. It would also be a problem with ice, and that certainly is the case here. So as you can see, as we continue to talk about tunnels and other issues with the right-of-way, this is very curvy through here, very sharp curve. You can imagine a long freight train having to slow down here would substantially add to the time it would take for that train to get through this location. So, our next stop is going to be at a location where, here on the old road, the Warren Railroad still, is where one of the alignments of the proposed cutoff might have come in. It didn't, but we'll show you where it would have come in had that particular version of the cutoff been built. Here we are at Ramseyburg Road in Knowlton Township, New Jersey. You can see where the old road passed. You have embankments on each side here. There was a bridge that crossed over this road. This is where line C would have ended up. Line C of the Lackawanna Cut-Off, had that particular alignment been adopted. It would have gone through several mountains from the area of Waterloo or Hackettstown in that neck of the woods, and would have crossed about a mile or so south of the town of Hope, and would have come out through a tunnel not very far from this location, and somehow would have connected to the old road at this location. It was never built. So our next stop, which is really not too far away, we're about at this point maybe midway between Manunka Chunk Tunnel and Delaware. Our next stop is at Delaware, New Jersey. Here we are in Delaware, New Jersey. This way is back towards Ramseyburg Road and the tunnel, and this way is toward the Delaware Water Gap, Slateford Junction. There's very little that's left here in Delaware of what originally was here. This station and the station building would be basically where just to the left of where the gas station building is. This station had the distinction as being the only place in the Lackawanna, the whole Lackawanna system, 900 miles of Lackawanna system, where 3 separate railroads served that location. The Lackawanna, of course, here, but also the Pennsylvania Railroad, which I mentioned at Manunka Chunk, and then the New York Susquehanna and Western came in here, which was the John Blair's railroad. Remember the very first episode we talked about his wife possibly taking a train from Blairstown to this location. Well, she could have done that. It's possible. And that she would have gone to the station here and gotten a train into New York if in fact she wanted to shop that particular day. So we're now going to move over to Pennsylvania. There's a short section, a little bit longer though than on the cutoff, but there is a short section of the old road which is in Pennsylvania. So that'll be our next stop, just a little bit south of Portland, Pennsylvania. Here we are on the old road in Pennsylvania. This is not the Warren Railroad anymore, since we're now in Pennsylvania. The Warren Railroad would have ended more or less at the water's edge. We're looking at the 1904 bridge. Once again, this is one of the upgrades that was made by President Truesdale in order to support larger cars and locomotives. But at the time, they knew that this is really going to be replaced. There was already chatter about building a new railroad to replace this old road. But because of a variety of things, it wasn't going to happen quickly enough, and as a result, they replaced this bridge, which they replaced the bridge that was to the right of this bridge, which was an 1890 bridge, with this bridge, 1904. This is actually the third bridge at this location. There was one even before that was here, the original bridge. Now, this is still here. There's still track here, as a matter of fact. This is Norfolk Southern Territory. Although it appears to be almost never used, this piece of track could be used by a locomotive that would actually come in and out of the power plant, which is around in this direction here. When it was coal-fired, there were almost on a regular basis coal cars sitting around the bend here and waiting to be fed into the power plant. several years ago, the power plant with the coal burning aspect of the power plant was decommissioned and replaced with oil. I personally have not heard of any shipments coming in here with oil, but in theory that could still happen. And in fact, these tracks have been significantly improved by Norfolk Southern. What would happen is that the train would come in here and that locomotive would be disconnected or uncoupled from the train, go out here, possibly a little bit out onto the bridge, and then go back through this switch here and then be able to get to the other end of the train. So this is the last section of the old road for us to cover today. We're just a couple of miles south of Portland. That's going to be our next stop, and there will be a couple more stops after that, but those are actually directly related to the cutoff itself, as a matter of fact. Here we are at the station in Portland, Pennsylvania, at approximately milepost 83.3, which if you compare, if you go via the cutoff to Slateford Junction, that's at milepost 74. So we're already, you can see how much longer it is just to get to this point on the old road, and we're still not to Slateford Junction yet, although we're getting there. This station here is interesting in that the tracks used to go here where I'm standing at one time and went up along approximately what was Route 611. 611 then was built, and at the same time the tracks were moved to the other side and then were moved closer to the river as it was in their present alignment. So this, at this point, as I mentioned previously, is not the Warren Railroad anymore, but it is the old road. So we have yet two more stops to make. One is underneath the cutoff again, and then Slateford Junction. Here we are at the Delaware River Viaduct as we stand on the old road. There's not much I can say about the Delaware River Viaduct that I haven't already said, but as you can tell, the old road will pass underneath the Delaware River Viaduct. And at this point, from where the old road passes under the cutoff, we're about a mile and a half from Slateford Junction. So that is our last stop on our trip across the old road and the Warren Railroad. Here we are at Slateford Junction, finally. It's been a long day, and as you can see, darkness is falling here. You can see there are cars for the Delaware Lackawanna that are parked here. This is milepost 74 if you were to go via the Lackawanna Cut-Off from Port Morris Junction. Be approximately milepost 85 if you went via the old road. Now the question we sought to answer in this particular episode, part 6, was why was the cutoff built? And hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of why the cutoff actually was built. Clearly there were deficiencies with the old road, not the least of which was that it was 11 miles longer and in the wrong place, if you will. But also there were the two tunnels which caused problems, and there was also the bridge over the Delaware, which was also restricted speeds as well. So that in a nutshell was the rationale for the Lackawanna replacing the route, which they started looking into seriously about 1905. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, by 1908 they had lined up and agreed on a route, and they actually started construction, which ended with the opening of the new route on Christmas Eve, that is December 24th, 1911. So this is the end of part 6, and hopefully you will look forward to seeing part 7 of the Lackawanna Cut-Off.